So the last thing that we covered were factitious disorders. Now, factitious disorders are different from somatic disorders. Remember that factitious disorders are a person deliberately making themselves sick or faking an illness. That's different from somatic. In a somatic disorder, a person thinks they are legitimately ill. Okay, they just over focus on the symptoms, or they're more sensitive to the symptoms. They're afraid that they have a debilitating disease and that they can't find a way to prove it, but they legitimately think that they're ill. Or they have symptoms, but it's psychological symptoms manifesting as a physical disease rather than a physical disease that manifests from a physical cause. Okay, so factitious disorders are factitious, they're made up. The two different branches of this type of disorder are Munchausen's syndrome and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Okay, so Munchausen syndrome is when you make yourself sick, okay, or you pretend to be sick in exchange for attention or sympathy. So you're doing it to yourself. One example that I remember very vividly is a woman who was in the hospital and she had like blood poisoning and all of this bacteria in her blood, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was sending her into septic shock until they found out that she was injecting her IV with her own feces. Well, that's one way to mess up your blood. Yeah, it makes you feel very, very icky. All right, and so they discovered that that's what was causing her illness, that she was doing it to herself, and that's Munchausen's syndrome. Now, Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when you make someone else sick to get attention or sympathy for yourself. So this is typically done by somebody who is a caregiver or a caretaker or a parent, and they want to get sympathy or attention because of how much they're sacrificing for this person who's sick, whether it's their spouse or their child or a foster child. Like Eminem, his mother had him in and out of hospitals his entire childhood because she suffered from Munchausen's by proxy syndrome. So she would constantly take him to the doctors and make him even believe that he was sick and there was something wrong with him so that she could get attention and medications. This can include, like, there's a video that I've posted in the Schoology lecture page, hospitals catching parents smothering their own babies, okay, in order to gain attention and garner sympathy. Like, not smothering them enough to kill them, but smothering them enough to say, oh no, they stopped breathing, and have everybody rush in and do all this attention and this sympathy. There was a very famous example with, I forget, I think she's, I think her name is Gypsy Rose. Yeah, where she allegedly had cancer, but in reality, her mother was just making her sick and making her think she had cancer. And so she ended up, well, spoilers, I won't let you know. She and her mom did not get along very well. Okay, but that's Munchausen's by proxy. Okay, it's not a real disease, it's inflicted for sympathy or attention. Okay, so that finishes factitious disorders. Now we're going to move into disassociative disorders. So y'all may have heard of disassociation. This is the phenomenon when your mind separates from your body. Oftentimes it's going to occur in traumatic experiences where your brain can't mentally cope with the scenario that's going on. And so it can lead to this out of body experience, like you're floating above your body and you're watching these things happen, but you don't recognize that they're happening to yourself. Okay, so you're like outside of yourself. It's not really happening to you. And some people with depression or PTSD do experience minor disassociation throughout the day, where they feel completely detached from their emotions or from their reality, and they can just like stare off into space and not follow a conversation. But extreme disassociation, okay, has some pretty clear symptoms. Okay, so a person's memories or emotions can be split off from conscious awareness. Now, the most controversial version of this is dissociative identity disorder. It's formerly known as multiple personality disorder. And this is very, very controversial because there's some people who say, yes, there is evidence that DID is real. And there are some people who say, no, it's just another factitious disorder where they're making up personalities and doing it for attention. So some of the signs that are in support of DID include different personalities not being aware of each other, different personalities having different handwriting, using different hands to write, having medical disorders, like one needing glasses and the other not needing glasses, or one being diabetic and the other not being diabetic. So all of these differences that would be so complicated to keep track as just one person, but it's almost as if it's one body, but there's multiple people living within that one body. Okay. But that's the most extreme form of the dissociative disorders. There are some less extreme forms that we're going to get into. And in fact, that's two of the movies on the list for your Unit 8 project, Split and Sybil. Many of you probably already seen Split because it's more recent, but both of those deal with dissociative identity disorders. So if you wanted to go into detail about how the media portrays them versus how the DSM portrays them. Okay, so the first disorder we're going to cover is dissociative amnesia. This is selective memory loss. So y'all may remember retroactive or proactive amnesia, where they either forget everything from before the trauma, like an accident, or they aren't able to form new memories after the trauma. Okay, but it's very, very solid. It's like, okay, here's the point, and it's either everything before or everything after. With dissociative amnesia, it's selective memory loss. You don't forget everything, you just forget parts of something. It's not from a brain injury or a concussion, it's from a traumatic event. Okay, so for instance, a woman who gives birth to a stillborn baby, okay, may be so traumatized by that loss that she completely erases her memories of ever being pregnant. That doesn't mean she forgets who her husband is or she forgets where she lives. It's just selectively memories that are related to that traumatic event. And that amnesia can last a very long time, or it can disappear just as abruptly as it appeared. But it's not something that's often going to reoccur. It's more so you have one dissociative amnesia case, or one episode of dissociative amnesia, and then you don't go through that again. Okay, so this is in response to a trauma, not a physical trauma like a brain injury, like a lesion, okay, but more of an emotional, psychological trauma. Are we good so far? A more extreme version of this is dissociative amnesia with fugue. Now, a dissociative amnesia with fugue is where they forget their entire identity. Okay, so it's like complete amnesia. They don't remember their name. They don't know who they are. They don't know where they live. They don't know anything about themselves, but they go on and start a new life. Okay, so just imagine you woke up in the middle of a Walmart, no idea who you are, no idea what city you're in, but you just walk around until you figure stuff out. And you like start buying things or get a job or start a family. You have a completely different life. Now that amnesia could end and your memory can reoccur. And then you realize, oh, for the last 28 years, I'd been living in Montgomery and teaching, but now in my new life, I was a marine biologist or something completely weird and different. So that fugue could end and you recover your memories and you return to the previous life, or it could continue indefinitely or occur repeatedly over time. So it's not like, oh, you have one fugue episode and then you're done forever. Sometimes those fugue episodes will happen again and again. And in the lecture unit on Schoology, I actually have a video of like a professor who went through a dissociative fugue, who woke up not knowing what languages he spoke, not knowing anything about himself, and even being shown pictures of him as a younger man and having no idea who that person was or who the other people in those pictures were. So it's not caused by a lesion in your brain. Okay, some major event, some trigger happens and you completely forget who you are. Now, dissociative identity disorder is also in response to trauma. Most often, it's a response to childhood trauma, often extreme violence or abuse. And what happens is that your mind literally splits. It breaks into or splinters into different parts. Okay, and these parts, these personalities that develop, serve a purpose. The most common personality that emerges with dissociative identity disorder is the protector personality. So if you're going through an extremely abusive or extremely traumatic, violent event, and you can't, or you feel like you can't defend yourself because you're a child, oftentimes a strong, fierce fighter personality will emerge. And then every time you're triggered with a fight or flight response, that personality comes out and takes over and plays the protector role. Okay, and so personalities emerge in response to the environment to handle that environment. But when this happens, it can split off communication to those other personalities or those other parts in your mind. So some personalities are aware of others. Okay, some personalities aren't aware of the others. Sometimes they can communicate with each other. Sometimes they don't communicate. It's uncontrollable which personality is in charge at which time. Okay, but there are certain triggers that can allow one personality to take over, like the protective personality, in order to get through a stressful situation. Okay, and even though there's a lot of controversy about this diagnosis, it is still recognized in the DSM-5. Okay, so this is still a legitimate diagnosis. It's just renamed from multiple personalities to DID. Are we good so far? Okay. So one of the interesting parts about DID is the fact that it involves a lot of the unconscious mind, and that's because it involves repression. Remember, repression and suppression are two different things. Repression is unconscious pushing away of a memory. You don't remember the repressed memory. You aren't aware that you tried to get rid of it or that your brain got rid of it. It's just gone. Okay. Suppression is when you're aware of the memory, you're aware of the event, but you try to avoid it. You try to push it away. Okay. So DID isn't the result of you go through a trauma and you remember it and you try to forget it, because that would be conscious. DID is a result of unconscious coping mechanisms. Your brain splintering apart to protect your main personality from those memories by putting those memories instead with your alter personalities. And so often the traumatic event that triggers this sort of disorder is an abusive event during childhood, when the brain is still forming, where it's able to split off into those parts. Are we good so far? All right. So now let's do a little bit of review about OCD. Y'all may remember that the O stands for obsession, which is a recurrent thought. The C stands for compulsion, which is a recurrent behavior. Now, when we think about OCD, more often than not, in media, it's going to be portrayed as symmetry, order, or exactness. Okay, the idea that someone is OCD means that they like things a certain way, or they like things to be straightened or ordered in a certain particular fashion. Even though that's how the media likes to portray OCD, or how we are most likely to recognize it, that's not the majority symptom of most people with OCD. Only 17% report an obsession with symmetry or order or exactness. Okay, more like 40% report an overwhelming repetitive thought concerned with germs and germophobia, or 24% something terrible happening if they don't complete their rituals. Okay, so that's another example of how in your Unit 8 project, you may have some media portrayal overemphasizing certain symptoms like symmetry and order, and underemphasizing germophobia, which is a much wider reported symptom in this particular disorder. Or you may have media portraying people with mental disorders as particularly violent, when in fact the opposite is true. People with mental illnesses are not more likely to be perpetrators of violence. They're more likely to be victims of violence. In terms of compulsions or repetitive behaviors, this makes sense that the majority thought or behavior for OCD is germophobia. Therefore, the majority of people with OCD, okay, engage in excessive cleaning or grooming habits because of that obsession or phobia of germs. Repeating rituals of going in or out a door, or flicking on or off lights a certain number of times. Okay, that's also a majority of people with OCD. checking locks or doors or homework or the car brake. That's also a large percentage, but not a majority of people with OCD. Okay, so there are many different ways that these disorders can manifest. And there's also many different ways in which they can be treated. Remember, the DSM-5 doesn't say the only way to treat OCD is with medicine, or the only way to treat OCD is with cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, it leaves it open-ended. It says, here are the symptoms, here's the prognosis. Okay, but there's multiple areas where you could go to for treatment. Does that make sense so far?